Welcome to our jointly sponsored film screening and panel discussion. Project Censored is honored to partner with the Real News Network for tonight's presentation. I'm Mickey Huff, the director of Project Censored. Special thanks to Kayla Rivara, John Duda, Dwayne Gladden, Charles Lenchner, and our host, Jassel Noor at the Real News Network, as well as everyone else at the Real News Network, which is a fantastic independent journalistic outlet that we're honored to partner with this evening. We like to thank our co-sponsors, City Lights Books and Publishers and Seven Stories Press, both of whom have published our work, both personally and as an organization, at Project Censored. This film is based in part, that you're about to see, on several of our most recent publications. You can learn more about our work and our publications at projectcensored.org. Also, special thanks are in order to T.M. Scruggs and Dennis Murphy, as well as our executive producers for the film, Janet and Richard Oscar, our producers, Christopher Oscar and Doug Hecker of Hole in the Media Productions, who made our previous award-winning documentary, Project Censored the Movie, Ending the Reign of Junk Food News. Student filmed and produced, edited and narrated by Abby Martin of the Empire Files. This evening's film, United States of Distraction, Fighting the Fake News Invasion, chronicles critical media literacy and faculty experts, students, and media makers that provide contextual analysis for understanding the current rise of the so-called fake news phenomenon. In addition to deconstructing fake news, the film reminds us that this is not a new development, but rather a form of propaganda. The interviews provided in the film offer alternative solutions for mitigating the pernicious influence of false content on America's democratic institutions. Ones that involve critical media literacy education, like the kind of curriculum Project Censored has shared with scores of colleges across the U.S. since 1976. We're looking forward to the panel conversation and Q&A once the film is over. It's about 64 minutes long, where I'll be joined by Abby Martin, Eleanor Goldfield, and Nolan Higdon, all responsible for making the film and starring in it. I hope you enjoy the United States of Distraction, Fighting the Fake News Invasion, and I look forward to our conversation when the film is over. Thanks for watching.
The 21st century brought a digital media revolution that promised more information at our fingertips than ever before. It was supposed to make life easier, bringing convenience and accessibility. Yet it simultaneously brought new dangers to consumers, like the ubiquitous consumption of fake news, like this.
I'm guided by the beauty of our weapons, and they are beautiful pictures of fearsome armaments making what is for them a brief flight over this airfield.
A lot of my consumption habits is coming from TV, clickbait news stories, usually about entertainment. Every now and again I go on Yahoo, but I tend to stay away from it if I'm trying to have a good day.
Some people will just start clicking on websites and links and not really think about where they're going, and then they'll end up somewhere they shouldn't be. And then a lot of people can sort of become radicalized by some of that stuff.
It's really easy to get lost. You start going down a rabbit hole, and all of a sudden you think, what do I do with my day?
We're so consumed with media, so consumed with our phones that it's like we hardly ever take the time to really look at what's going on outside.
it's called social media, but it's not, the most social thing, because everyone's screen, is like an individual screen. Just the narratives and just kind of how those cater each specifically to that person. Even though I get to choose what I'm looking for, it
would just be like a shouting game.
And depending on what you're watching or what it is that you're doing, you will notice that you're always being constantly distracted, watched, and advertised to.
People my age are using social media as their primary outlet for news consumption, which can be dangerous, of course, because they're not verified sources largely.
Being used to this social media age where we want the instant gratification of likes and shares and everything like that, it makes it hard to be critical of that and think critically about what we're absorbing and choose how we want to be affected by the media that we consume. Because at this stage, I feel that a lot of people are affected and have an emotional response to news and whatever media they're consuming.
They look at likes, it's like an addiction. It's the next thing. It's gives them that high that they're looking for. It may not be from alcohol or any type of drug, but it still releases some sense endorphins in your mind to kind of just stimulate you and just make you feel good about yourself.
I suffer from that myself, full irony, right? I'm a media educator, and yet there I am on Facebook way too many hours of the day. Twitter is a bit more focused tool for me, but Facebook is a time sink. And I think that's true for a lot of Americans, well, a lot of people around the world, really. And unfortunately, there are lots of dangers attached to that because, I grew up at a time when we had 3 channels. Well, 4 if you counted PBS. So you couldn't really watch TV all day long. You couldn't consume this kind of media all the time.
There's this other habit of ours feeling that if we're not in the know constantly, we're left behind. And I think that also feeds this really bad habit that we've come to experience, along with our phones. It's constant. The messaging is constant, yet the messaging, along with the programming, is so horrific that it's not allowing ourselves to stop and really ask the bigger questions in life.
I think when it feels like we're paying attention to everything, a negative consequence of that could be that we are qualitatively paying attention to nothing. We think we're good at that, but in fact our brains don't multitask. They monotask. Our brains are really generous and try and monotask as quickly as possible, but I think we're also hurting our brains a little bit with all this multitasking.
The average person spends somewhere between 11 and 16 hours a day consuming media, which is quite amazing considering the fact the average person sleeps 8 hours a day. So most of the time people are awake, they're consuming media. And so as a result, it influences people's perspectives of the world, it informs people, and media has a place in humans' lives unmatched by anything else. It's a really big influence in who we are.
We are rewarded the more time we spend with media. We are rewarded the more distracted we are by media. All of our media choices can fit in our pocket if we have a smartphone, which means we can be checking email, checking text messages on all of our social media platforms, watching TV, watching movies, listening to music, catching up on the news, in a teeny tiny little device. We never have to turn our media off, right? I mean, the internet is, if it is available, it is always available. So we never need to turn our media off.
We are drowning in information and we don't know how to sort it. And having more of it isn't really necessarily helping us. Greater access is interesting, but if you just accept everything and filter nothing, what is that doing to our thinking and our interaction with other humans when it comes to human interaction?
We're not allowing ourselves to think. We're using the ideals, the messaging of others to really navigate our own lives. And with that, we don't have that quiet time to ask harder questions. I think that is also taking us and taking many, especially our more vulnerable people, and I'm calling out the teens, to a much more depressive state. Because although on the surface level, it looks like you're connected to what's going on, the emptiness that you're experiencing in your own life is tremendous. And I think there are so many kids who are experiencing that, adults as well.
It's a really antisocial set of images that we're receiving. And it makes us miserably unhappy. It is not conducive to happiness. because at the risk of sounding banal, I'll say that happiness comes from within. It comes from a certain sense of adjustment to one's surroundings and an ability to forge meaningful relationships with other people. It's based on an ability to care about other people, to do things for others, right? Whereas the messages that we absorb, whether they're advertising messages or often entertainments, heroic entertainments on TV or on the big screen, it's all about you.
Media in this country has come to dominate literally cognitive thought in a vast majority of Americans. And it's pretty deliberate. It's top-down controlled corporate media, very small number of companies owned by giant investment companies worldwide, and they are in the continued process of propagandizing us in terms of protecting capitalism and keeping us entertained and buying things.
Much of what we get is really just commercial advertising in disguise or half disguised, right? So it's meant to sell us not only on particular products that we don't really need and don't benefit from, but also on consumption as a way of life.
We're being manipulated to want to acquire things that we don't need, to kind of misinform us about some of the contradictions in global society and capitalism and gross inequalities, and better literally, using Neil Postman's term, entertaining us to death.
News reflects their interests. They tell us what is important. So it's important what celebrities are doing. It's not so important what your military is doing overseas. These are the good guys in these countries. These are the bad guys in that country. Our country's purpose is to make money. Education's purpose is to make money. All other things are socialist, communist, or other negative terms.
And the corporate media that oft works in concert with the two major corporate parties, they're largely selling the same agendas. And we don't really get a lot of bottom-up, diverse viewpoints expressed in our media. We get more of a managed top-down news propaganda that's more manufacturing consent among the public. So unfortunately, in the 21st century, we have quite the conundrum because we simultaneously have more information at our fingertips than we've ever had before, but we also have a paucity of understanding connected to the fact that we don't really develop critical thinking skills, and we don't teach many critical thinking skills in our K-12 curriculum.
It's incumbent upon the consumer to go find out what this source is, where it comes from, who generates it, and the purpose of its generation. So, and I think that we don't have a tolerance for that kind of work on our part. We're blind consumer. We just kind of, it's like eating junk food. We don't even think about it.
I guess you should first take note of the fact that we use that verb consume, right? As if media were something that we're feeding on, that we're swallowing, digesting, right? I think there's a difference between consuming media and using it to inform ourselves, to educate ourselves. But if we're consuming it, we're taking it in without giving it a whole lot of thought.
There's a real psychic problem and an emotional problem and a political problem. It's tiring because it's so sensational and your whole body and emotions get tired and exhausted. It's not providing the kinds of local and national and internews that we need. So it's actually a big time waster. And as we know, there's now a whole dimension of fake commercial news and fake political news.
We see a weird confluence of events happening in the 21st century. So fake news is also exploding in the social media realm because an individual can take one item and share it, and it can be spread everywhere. And even though it's fake, you can get a majority of the population to believe it. So we've put this already really powerful tool, which is news media, in everybody's hand. Everybody can make news, everybody can consume news. But what's missing from new media compared to old media, we used to have gatekeepers, and these gatekeepers theoretically had codes of ethics, and they were held up to standards by their colleagues. Now in the social media realm, people are only held up to their own morals and ethics, and we're finding a lot of people don't have morals and ethics.
Since the tumultuous events of the 1970s, with the confusion and lies surrounding the Vietnam War, Watergate, and the Church Committee hearings, which exposed connections between the CIA and the media, the American public has lost faith in its public institutions, including the so-called free press. At the same time, right-wing politicians and commentators injected American discourse with the hasty generalization that the news media had a liberal bias. The phrase's usage insinuated that the press was more focused on some liberal agenda than serving the public interest. It was an effective weapon to discredit any news reporting that challenged their worldview, a talking point that is permeated throughout American society to this day. Although there is nothing liberal about 6 corporations controlling 90% of the news media, conservatives continue to erroneously assert that it is fake news, not empirical data, that undermines their political, social, and economic policies. The ease with which it came to dominate American thinking was a harbinger of the fake news epithet that President Donald Trump exploited to discredit the press, that he described as the enemy of the American people.
A few days ago, I called the fake news the enemy of the people, and they are. They are the enemy of the people.
Don't we love that term, fake? What we've learned about fake over the last little while. Fake news. I'm not going to give you. Can you stay categorically? You are fake news. But you don't give straight news. You give fake news. No, not you. Not you. That was just fake news by NBC, which gives a lot of fake news. Your organization's terrible.
Because they have no sources. They just make them up.
Whoops, the camera just went off. Okay, you can come back. I won't say.
Quiet. And I want you all to know that we are fighting the fake news. It's fake, phony, fake.
Fake news is an actual problem, but not in the way that Trump uses the phrase to denounce journalists.
I would define fake news as anything that is not factual or accurately reported.
News that doesn't have any facts to support its arguments. It's targeted false information.
Just misinformation that is put out and claimed real.
Fake facts, opinions, without any credible evidence.
Taking the fact of the story but completely transform them.
The first person that comes to my mind is somebody like Alex Jones. Some of his stories are from InfoWars, and some of his stories are true and have been fact-checked, yet he is taking the time to sensationalize them and twist them and tweak them in certain ways to get people to react in certain ways.
Facebook is a really big place for what you could call fake news, because people just put their ideas out there and then it's passed off as truth, but when in reality it's their truth and not an actual universal truth.
And it's the ruling elite that really serve to benefit from all of the propaganda, and so it's really easy and clickbaity with social media and hashtags and, a good PR team.
It is an uphill battle dealing with media outlets, media companies, media conglomerates, that there is a goal of hegemony.
Whoever is in control of the money is in control of the minds of the public, for sure.
There's always been fake news. There's always been rumors. There's always been news that's been dominated by the elite. And there's always been news that's all about junk as opposed to what people really need. The problem in the current era is that the scope and scale has just increased dramatically. So fake news at the moment is driven by machines, driven by algorithms, and driven by the profit motive.
Everything's about hits and likes, and they'll do pretty much anything in this bread and circuses mode to generate those likes or hits, taking people away from the things that really matter in favor of stories that simply don't matter at all, don't push the needle, don't have anything relevant to say about our daily lives or our politics.
You can find fake news kind of across the political spectrum in the United States these days. It's often generated by powerful state or corporate actors within kind of the corporate commercial for-profit model of news. And news in the United States is an industry. It is a manufactured phenomenon.
Well, fake news has become kind of a buzzword that was first used to further demonize Donald Trump, and then was used by Donald Trump to demonize those who were demonizing him. So the phrase fake news is used by both sides, I think used by both sides with equal dishonesty.
But the Democrats originally started saying that part of the reason that Trump was electored in by the Electoral College and became president was because people didn't come out and vote enough and they were fooled by fake news. Well, there's no real metric evidence that that actually happened and caused the election to go one way or the other. Then, of course, the Trump campaign and administration picked up on that fake news talk. So they basically, Trump turned around and said, well, anybody that's criticizing me or saying anything that I disagree with is fake news, right? And he started doing that with CNN and Jim Acosta and just saying like, well, you're fake news.
CNN, fake.
Were to do a Google search or even a search in academia maybe about 10 years ago, everything that's labeled as fake news would be shows like The Daily Show and The Colbert Report and SNL. That was fake news, and it meant that there's these news outlets that are doing satire. So they appear to be news, but they're actually mocking mainstream culture. There's a lot of attempts at cultural jamming and things like that. The word's been co-opted now by Donald Trump. Donald Trump has used fake news to be anything that he disagrees with. Anything challenges him he doesn't like, that is fake news.
Thanks to a president who tells us consistently that the press are the enemy of the people, a lot of our focus now would be on what I would tend to think of as fake news originating, the way the term is used by Trump as a weaponized term, is focused on what we would think of as the corporate news media, right? There's a weird way in which that critique has some veracity, has some reality to it, right? That for a long time, Project Censored has been making the argument that we should be wary of the corporate news media, that what they're providing us may not be literally fake news in the sense that that term is used now, but it certainly fits broad definitions of what propaganda is.
Fake news is propaganda, and it's generated by big public relation firms. The three largest are Omnicom, WPP, and Interpublic Group, and they in turn have hundreds of small public relations propaganda firms all over the world that work with them. And they represent products, they represent corporations, they represent governments, they represent the Pentagon, and they are producing news stories and public relations pieces that corporate media literally runs as if they were news. So some 80% of corporate media today, the news there, is prepackaged by a public relations propaganda firm that has an agenda. And that agenda is to essentially entertain us, keep us afraid of things that, of terrorists, and to make us support the state and support capitalism.
News, by and large, is news by and about elites. And especially, there's a huge body of literature in the sociology of news construction about how corporate news depends on official bureaucratic sources as the newsworthy perspectives and the newsworthy actors. And that's really different when you start looking at independent media. Independent media and independent journalists are still dependent on sources, but the difference is the diversity of people who are treated as being newsworthy is so much more broad when we look at independent news media in comparison to the corporate news media.
Only certain people's stories are told, only certain stories about the world are acceptable, and there's a wide variety, a massive vision of actions and a whole globe of communities out there working toward everything from a better life to ending the war to saving the environment that we just don't hear about.
The fluff, the infotainment that's peddled by corporate outlets such as CNN, MSNBC, Washington Post, New York Times, that is fake news. What they want you to believe that's fake news is, of course, the exact opposite. The alternative media outlets that go to the front lines of domestic and foreign fights, whether that be environmental fights, racial justice fights. They want to brand that fake news because, of course, when you go to the front lines of these conflicts, you will see the reality of the empire laid bare.
Fake news is meant to tag certain kinds of stories or opinions as dangerously false, toxic, and increasingly linked to Russia, okay? So that, we're actually living through a moment that's a kind of throwback to the 60s when J. Edgar Hoover and Richard Nixon and others, the CIA, were all convinced that the tumult of that decade, the anti-war movement, the civil rights movement, the feminist movement, and so on, the assumption was all this stuff is obviously being fed by the communists. It's coming from the Kremlin. Only now it's, liberals and many progressives who are assuming that the prevalence of these divisive narratives or concerns is due to some kind of Russian connection, as if there's not enough wrong with the system we're living in, and as if people are not smart enough to see many of the things that are wrong on their own without the help of Putin's minions, right?
Again, we have so much information. People are saying, look, this is coming from Russia, and Russia took out fake ads on Facebook, and some Macedonian teenager was getting paid to pump out false stories about the Pope and Trump and Hillary and these kind of things. Well, yeah, that is fake news. Is this done for ill effect? Well, arguably it could be, right? It certainly could be used to deceive the public, and yeah, that would be fake news. But I think the far more insidious kind of fake news is actually corporate and deep state propaganda. Because that is done with the intent to deceive, but it also has the trappings of an official narrative supporting a status quo.
Most dangerous untruths pumped out today don't come from Donald Trump, whose lies are mostly idiotic and trivial and really, really obvious, okay? I mean, he'll lie about the size of his inaugural crowd, stuff like that, right? The New York Times and the Post and, NPR and Rachel Maddow and all the rest of them, they make stuff up about Russia's interference with the election. It's based on no evidence at all.
All right, Rachel Maddow. I feel like we have spent the last 2 years doing one story, right?
Doing a lot of one story.
Right.
Is our president subordinate to a foreign power? And again, I have to stress that we need to describe this dossier as an unverified dossier of Russian allegations against Donald Trump. That Bernie Sanders lovers page, run out of Albania, it's still there. Every day I lead my show and I think I'm going to be talking about something else. But every day, over the course of the news cycle, a new piece of it falls in place. Russian-backed online trolls flooded social media to try to block Mitt Romney from getting the Secretary of State job. This is like 9/11. This is the red warning lights blinking. This is we need to be aware that the risk to the country right now is as strong as the risk was before 9/11.
The liberal media consistently pumps out this kind of fake news, I think, which is mostly hatched by the CIA and other government agencies. And this stuff is war propaganda. This stuff is really deeply dangerous. Fake news is an enormous problem. But part of the problem of fake news is the very misuse of that phrase by its most adroit practitioners.
We've been in the business, we like the United States, of creating fake news sort of on purpose for decades. We have the creation of the CIA after World War II, and they carry out covert operations, and those covert operations are carried out with plausible deniability, meaning that they can make things happen of great political importance in countries around the world and then be able to lie about it later. And the media will write stories about it as though the lie that was put out, the cover stories, were true.
So I always want to think about all this stuff from my vantage position as a transnational scholar, and think about the historical context in which media has always been used to disadvantage people from the places like where I come from in Africa. And so I sometimes stretch it all the way back to like concepts like Orientalism as like the intellectual habitus through which this idea of putting out false information about other people, kind of takes root. And so for me, I'm interested more about fake news in that context of how it always has functioned as an official policy of managing affairs outside of the West.
Interestingly, if you go back in the history of fake news, if you want to go back to the 1600s even, where they talk about, the theocratic states were talking about propagating the faith, and that's where we get derive the term propaganda. Going up into the 17th, 18th century, we still have, fake news took on different form in terms of hoax stories, right? Literally fake stories designed to either fool people or as entertainment. Then, of course, you have famous cases in the 19th century in the United States, like the Great Moon Hoax, people on the moon and things. That's, hoax stories. Do we still have hoax stories in the 20th century? Yes, we do. They range from the satirical to the humorous to the extraordinarily deceptive.
Like after World War II, you had the media empire of Henry Luce, who ran like Time and Life magazine. And he was a guy who advocated specifically for the U.S. to create an American century where we would dominate the globe as to the extent possible. That capitalism and capitalist powers in the United States, corporate power, would dominate and sort of establish order throughout the rest of the world. And so he would put out information and a worldview that was in accordance with that. And a lot of important things happen, and the American public gets completely misinformed about them. For example, Indonesia in 1965 was described in the New York Times as a gleam of light, and that involved the massacre of 500,000 people to 2 million people who were Indonesian PKI members. They were communists, but they were involved in the democratic political system there, or the emerging democratic political system. And a lot of just ethnic Chinese were just killed just because they were perceived as being close to the PKI. And there was a CIA officer named Ralph McGahey who became one of the famous dissidents of the CIA and reported on a lot of their inner workings. And he used the word fake news in his memoir, talking about Indonesia and what really happened there. And he said, today's fake news is tomorrow's fake history. So a lot of the people that are talking about fake news today are connected to institutions that have been creating some of the same fake news that led to the fake history that we have, which is a sort of distorted, idealized version of the U.S. role in the world since the end of World War II especially.
It's very difficult to get a peaceful population to go along with basically what we're talking about in war is murder of heads of states, but now certainly murder and destruction of entire cultures and peoples, such as the war in Yemen. I think that getting the civilian populations to go along with war for the entire 20th century, from the First World War to the Second World War to the First Gulf War, where Saddam Hussein was charged with ripping babies out of their incubators.
While I was there, I saw the Iraqi soldiers come into the hospital with guns. They took the babies out of the incubators, and left the children to die on the cold floor.
Which was pure propaganda. It never happened. And you need these kinds of shocking, anti-humanitarian kind of narratives to whip up a civilian population, to demonize an enemy. We've seen that now, in which Trump constantly demonizes people of color, immigrants. This is a dark, fearful place to be, and that is where fake news ends up today, oftentimes from the legacy of war propaganda.
Today we're seeing the rise of these pseudo-leftist news organizations that are promoting what we like to call hipster-style propaganda. And those include BuzzFeed and Vice News. And I'm just going to use Vice News as an example of an organization that went from a fashion magazine to now one of the top leading media organizations in the world that promotes war propaganda. And how they did this was, first of all, Rupert Murdoch became one of the largest shareholders of the company a few years ago. And Vice News began to slowly but surely align itself and work with figures that were coming out of the Obama administration. And so we saw Vice News take a huge shift into promoting kind of a neoliberal war agenda. And if you look at some of their coverage, a lot of it echoes what the State Department pushes out in their press releases to promote war policies that justify war in countries like Libya, in countries like Syria, and countries like Venezuela. And a big reason for this is because Vice News has also been found to be receiving a lot of its information about these issues directly from the State Department and directly from the U.S. government through the Broadcast Board of Governors, which is a legal arm of the U.S. government to promote propaganda.
The history of media in the United States is not different than almost every other country, and that is that state governments, state actors try to control the flow of information, not only where it goes to, but what's inside that flow. I would say if we're inside the United States, a lot of times, historical memory doesn't sometimes go back as far as it should. So a lot of times now when people talk about Trump, they like to compare things to the rise of fascism in Europe and so on in the 1930s. But I think it's just as relevant to look at us being in the moment of 1916 and 1917 and 18, just before the United States went into World War I, where Woodrow Wilson ran on a platform of he kept us out of the war. And of course, once he got in, he was, continued on his pro-war footing just more openly. And the people who were against the war suffered severe repression. And that went together with the equivalent of shutting down the internet that we're seeing now, and that throttling, which at that time was to be able to get things to move from city to city, it was through the mail.
If you look back at the early colonial period and early revolutionary period, America found it really important to have newspapers. And so we subsidized the press in the early start of the country. And that's why every town ended up having about 2 newspapers. And we subsidized the printing press, so media flooded everywhere. You could read news quite often through newspapers. But then in the 20th century, we started to see changes. People got a little more worried about news because you had seen these things like yellow journalism, which had sold the Spanish-American War to the American public on a lie. And so these new inventions came out like radio and eventually television, and the public was realizing the dangers of media, that the radio was a really powerful tool. And so there's a big grassroots movement in 1934 for the government to regulate how many media outlets any individual could own. This way we believed diversity of media was good for democracy. We adapted that to newspapers, we adapted that to television. We also put other safeguards in place too. We had a fairness doctrine, so if someone said something negative about you, they had to pay for you to come on their show to get the equal amount of time. And then starting in the 1980s, we started to remove these safeguards. So Bill Clinton with Republican Congress passed the 1996 Telecommunications Act.
This law is truly revolutionary legislation that will bring the future to our doorstep. This historic legislation, in my way of thinking, really embodies what we ought to be about as a country.
That got rid of the diversity of ownership, so now you could own as many media outlets as you want. We went from 50 corporations down to 6, and there's mergers in the books right now. We may go down to 4, controlling 90% of our news media. We got rid of the fairness doctrine. We got rid of proposals to protect kids from advertising in the 70s and 80s. And this allowed this news media to pop up that theoretically could say whatever it wanted, and it wasn't doing anything necessarily illegal or immoral. And so you saw Rush Limbaugh came out the same year the Fairness Doctrine died. Fox News came out the same year of Telecommunications Act. And Americans got a sensibility of news media that was polarized. So the facts didn't matter. It was either you took a left-wing perspective or a right-wing perspective. And so we've now ended up in this place where this post-truth reality where people base their assertion on facts, on their political proclivities, and actual reality. Fox, for its part, echoes whatever Donald Trump says. In fact, Fox's television show Fox and Friends even caught Donald Trump live tweeting with Fox. So he tells them what to say via Twitter. They repeat it. They comment on it. He then comments on their comments. They then report what he commented. So this has become how these outlets are part of the political propaganda apparatuses.
And then we have this sort of hyper fake news that's arrived, where it's literally trying to aggregate a community on the basis of their likes or actually their hatred of other people. And that's the most inflammatory, dangerous kind of fake news that's been going on. The assemblage of white supremacists or people who are anti-LGBTQ community or other people who were assembled because of a very, very strong sensation of hatred of the other.
So much of the websites that proliferated around fake news, such as the Daily Stormer and Breitbart, they took their cues and they learned very much from the broadcasting of Fox News, which was the first broadcast entity that we had in this country that followed a Republic government line. And there are documents and memos that show that they took their talking points every day from the Bush White House. That's George W. Bush. The way that it played out in 2016 is often underplayed, I think, in the mainstream media, and where Donald Trump and much of his supporters retweeted and so much of the fake news that came from Breitbart and the very dangerous website Daily Stormer, that it was openly fascist, that they appealed to a very angry base of voters that became voters steeped in racism and anti-immigrant stories.
Trump figured out the game. Trump figured out the game is tap into the vulnerabilities. What do the media want? They don't want truth. They were never able to commodify truth. They want eyeballs. They want attention. What gets attention? Spectacles. So Trump was able to get the spectacle excitement. He got attention. Almost 3-1 over Hillary Clinton attention in news media, and he used that to launch his career.
The dominant legacy news media, which is dependent on getting large audiences for large advertisers, has done very well by Donald Trump. So rather than just ignore him, they're responding to him immediately and over again. And in a way, he's been very profitable for them. So they continue to cover him.
The trends are negative at the moment, with Google changing its algorithms to really drastically reduce traffic to certain sites like Consortium News, World Socialist website, Truthout. Most of these progressive websites, media outlets, have seen their traffic fall drastically because Google's algorithm just exiles them to some netherworld.
And they're basically saying, you over there at Counterpunch, you over there at the National Review, you're outside the mainstream, you're fake news. And so Google is algorithmically suppressing searches, so you can't even find those sources anymore unless you know about them already. Facebook is doing it. They're labeling stories fake. Even if they are factually accurate, they just come from sources that are outside, that realm of legitimate controversy that's owned by the two major corporate parties and the corporate media.
The problem is not just Trump. The problem is that across the board, there is an intensifying crackdown on inconvenient speech of all kinds. There is an intensifying crackdown on anti-Zionist speech, right? Which is, cast as anti-Semitism and so classified as a kind of hate speech. And this enables the authorities to police our speech in that way, right? Critics of American foreign policy, those who try to tell the truth about what's going on in places like Syria or Venezuela or Nicaragua or Russia, find themselves, again, blacked out, shadow banned on Facebook.
Not only were our articles that we were posting on the social media giant not getting the millions of reach that we were getting prior to the 2016 election, but now any article that we posted that criticized apartheid in Israel, U.S. aid to dictators around the world, or monarchies like Saudi Arabia, or if we criticized the war machine, or we exposed the humanitarian crisis in Yemen, or any of those kinds of stories that really brought attention to Americans, what was really going on behind all of the distraction news, those articles were getting flagged by Facebook as inappropriate content. And because it was working hand in hand with Saudi-funded and NATO-funded think tanks like the Atlantic Council, what Facebook did is basically give these foreign governments, give the military-industrial complex, and give the actual war machine, the very powers that be, absolute control over what information Americans see, hear, and read.
In the last National Defense Authorization Act, there was $160 million of taxpayer money allocated to create what was called a global engagement center, which was to create counter propaganda against fake news. But what's fake news? RT? Yes, according to the U.S. government, that's fake news. Except now they have to register as foreign agents. Are we doing that to the BBC? No. Are we, right? So it's propaganda. And so fake news is propaganda. But the whole idea of fake news now being in the news is a way to help them control the narratives and decide which things will be heard as legitimate and which will be completely pushed to the side. The Washington Post, in fact, a national security editor wrote a piece right after the 2016 election about all the conundrum of fake news and said what we need to do is have an organization that's going to tell us what's propaganda and what's not. And it's like, wow, this is going to be fun. So Craig Timberg wrote this article lionizing a private, shadowy, non-transparent organization called Prop or Not. And Prop or Not is an organization that didn't list who was in it, didn't list what the funding was, didn't list what their criteria or methodology were for determining something as propaganda or not.
And they had come up with this list of media organizations that included MidPress News and other media organizations like Truthdig, and I believe Truthout was on there as well. But then they also clumped us up with a lot of conspiracy sites and right-wing sites that were promoting a lot of hate.
Prop or Not is like, we know that there's 200 organizations involved, that they range from being useful idiots for Russia to being stooges for Putin and being Russian agents themselves. But on the list were groups like Counterpunch and Naked Capitalism and Dave Lindorf, an independent journalist out of Philadelphia. This can't be happening. So they're lumping in legitimate independent journalism that challenges the status quo and is, in fact, by the way, challenging the whole Russiagate narrative. So, and the Washington Post reported this as fact. Simultaneously, in fact, the Washington Post was calling, when Margaret Sullivan was still there as the media editor, she was actually calling then for a retirement of the term of fake news. And yes, we all say, yes, please, we don't want to hear that term anymore. Here we are in a fake news documentary, right? Let's retire the term. Well, how about retire the practice? Right? Then we won't have to worry about the term. If we retire the practice of propaganda and fake news, then we don't have to worry about talking about it. But the Washington Post, right at the same time that we have Timberg and Prop or Not and Margaret Sullivan saying, I think it's time to retire the term, the Washington Post is running a story about how Russia allegedly hacked the power grid in the state of Vermont. Never happened.
When the news system is based on advertising, is based on delivering audiences to advertising, and 80% of that advertising is controlled by two large multinational companies, Google and Facebook, you have a problem. And then the next problem is that they don't see themselves as news producers. They see themselves as basically advertising-driven companies. So they are taking no responsibility for controlling the curation or the circulation of that information. I think we're at a moment where we really have to challenge what truth is about. We're at a moment where the legacy news model is failing, and we have to evaluate that. And I think it's a good process. It wasn't functioning. It was dominated by elite production of news, which didn't serve the majority of people. So that didn't work. The new one that's based on a new group of oligarchs in Silicon Valley making money off of being the distributors of news and fake news doesn't work either.
Notice we can point fingers in lots of directions. We can blame Hillary, we can blame the DNC, we can blame the Republicans, we can blame the corporate media, we can blame Craig Timberg, we can blame Prop or Not, we can blame legislators, we can blame blacklisters, we can blame censors, we can blame algorithms. A lot of blame. Guess who else we can blame? Ourselves. Because ultimately, we need to develop critical thinking skills and critical media literacy and political and civic literacy, the degree to which we can ask the right questions and we can understand the complexity of situations where we're in the driver's seat.
Fake news, as Trump says it, actually opens up an opportunity for us because he's at least planted the idea in people's head there's something wrong with news media. If you can take that and sort of throw it back at people to say, let's reform news media rather than let's support Trump, it opens up a possible avenue. But, as Nicholas Johnson reminds us, whatever your first priority is, media better be your second or no one will ever hear about it. And that is to say, if we don't reform media, it doesn't matter what else you care about. Racism, sexism, classism, violence, war, we're not going to hear about it. We're going to hear a top-down narrative from corporate America about those issues. So you've got to get a media reform system so we can work on the barrage of issues that people care about in the United States.
There have been a series of solutions offered to solve the problem of fake news: censorship, blacklisting, laws and regulations. But all the solutions offered failed to address the root of the problem, one that perpetuates the pernicious influence of fake news. That citizens can't seem to tell fake news from real journalism. Critical media literacy, on the other hand, provides skills essential if the public is to deconstruct propaganda and discern alternative facts from real ones in our supposedly post-truth world.
An effective media education would be an education where we are taught, when we're given skills to analyze media, but not when we are given a way to think about media.
We have to be able to not only recognize information, but decode fake news, false information, and just bias.
No matter how much the media or corporations will try to tell you that your opinion does not matter and that you need to listen to the experts, I think an effective media educator empowers their students to stand up against that kind of thinking.
Doing your own dive into the facts, not just taking anyone's word for it, because you can't just take anyone's word for it. That's why it kind of becomes a lifestyle, getting into news, or just following any kind of social justice issues or issues around the world, because you're constantly having to verify everything that's being said and forming your own opinion based on your own research.
Lately, I've been paying attention to the news that is mainstream, not necessarily believing it, but paying attention to what the person is trying to tell me and also listening to what they're not telling me.
Like, for example, I was not aware that fake news can come from any source. Like, the New York Times has posted numerous articles that were entirely falsified. Washington Post has done the same things, and those are two of my main sources for news. So, but that's taught me to not just, read, but to question what I read, to question everything. And that's what everyone should do.
We're in a time where we know that the media are biased, and that we should be the one responsible to make sure that we are aware of it.
I think being able to be a part of a team that helps open other people's eyes, get a clearer perspective of things, and get people's voices out there, I think that's highly important to me. I mean, I come from obviously a community that's not always had a voice.
And as I'm reading and consuming media, I try to look for the voices that are not there and understand that there's an agenda behind every single piece of media that I consume.
I know that journalists, are taught to strive for objectivity, but what is that striving process, right? I don't necessarily know if there's a problem with bias as long as we're clear. Right? I mean, we are human beings researching stories. We are human beings writing stories. That brings a certain level of subjectivity.
Journalism's job isn't to be objective and impartial. It's to tell the people what's really going on. And as an educator, I think my job is to give people the tools how to think, not to tell them what to think by what's on the test.
If I want to search for good education about media, I really have to put in the time to be able to do it, and then find that valuable source that I can maybe keep going back to. You got to turn off that television, you got to turn off that social media, and you have to start looking for what's real.
So real news is storied information that has 6 ingredients. Number 1, it's recent. Real news. Real news is recent, number 1. Number 2, real news is relevant, which is to say it's in play in the culture. It's something that people are talking about. Real news is number 3, reliable, which is to say it's transparently sourced. Real news, number 4, is about historical context. It provides some sense of history in the story. Number 5, real news is, as we like to say in the business, hegemonic, which is to say it's about power relations. It foregrounds power relations. And finally, real news, number 6, is harmonious in the sense that it offers multiple points of view, not sort of a blue state, red state, black versus white, he said, she said, but more nuanced and more sort of multi-perspectival, as we say in the business. So that, I think, is a good definition of real news. And when you define real news that way, you realize it can kind of be hard to find.
I think that folks need to get a bit more comfortable with researching on their own. Not that everyone needs to be a journalist, but everyone needs to do a little bit more work in becoming media literate, because at this point in time with the internet, everyone can be a journalist.
There can be a lot of sort of false narratives, right? And so independent news, I think, gets kind of pushed into that corner because they're less familiar, right? I mean, even if you don't like the New York Times, it's familiar, right? Even if you don't like the mainstream, ABC, NBC, CBS, Fox, we know who they are, right? With independent news, I think we have less knowledge of who they are. So it is on us as audiences to learn more about them.
We have to talk about the contexts in which fake news is produced and circulated, right? So we have to talk about what are the social contexts that and the technological media that make the circulation of fake news possible. And we have to educate ourselves about how fake news is constituted and how it spreads.
It is to look not just at the content, not just at representation, but also, again, that behind the scenes, the forces of production, who owns, who distributes, right? Who owns, who produces, and who distributes, because that's where that's where the power is, right?
Teaching people the political economy of the media, about their relationships with advertisers and with the government and so on, the history of the First Amendment and the function of copyright. All this information needs to be made available to everybody in this country, everybody, which means it should be a standard part of the curriculum in all our grade and high schools.
Most of the rest of the world in Europe, Eastern Europe, Asia, North Africa, they all saw that this media could potentially be a problem and of dangers about 30 or 40 years ago. At that time, they all tried to change their schooling policies to make sure that students went into this media-saturated society with some semblance of ways of protecting themselves, right? So some way to know how to sift through media and protect yourself. The U.S. is unique. We did not. We dropped this massive cultural bomb upon a generation without the skills to sift through it. And so we now end up in a society where the majority of people, they don't know the difference between who funds media, how that impacts the media. They don't understand that their data is being collected. They don't understand they're being spied on. They don't understand they're being surveilled. They don't understand their search history is being collected and then exchanged for advertising companies and other things.
So you would think the solution would be to train people with a critical media literacy so they're more aware of how to use these tools properly and in a way that is very responsible, in the sense that they're not going to get manipulated to the point where they're radicalized or something like that. However, the techno-utopian view is not that. The techno-utopian view is we just need more technology. Similarly, YouTube wanted to add Wikipedia pages to its content. However, this is severely problematic in its own right. Wikipedia is created through crowdsourcing, and people vote on content by either changing or not changing content. So if everybody is poisoned with falsehoods, how can we expect them to democratically decide what is true and what is not true? So this techno-utopian view, though, has largely taken over because America has a worshiping of these figures like Mark Zuckerberg, who claims that he's delivering democracy to the world, although there's no evidence the guy's ever taken a course on democracy.
One of the most hopeful things, if I can use that phrase, is that people all over the world now are taking media into their own hands and making images and pictures and representing themselves. So I think for the future, what we need to figure out is how to circulate that information more. I think for me, the best way to learn about how to make change is how people from the bottom up are making change.
I would be sort of proud to say that I think Project Censored is part of that effort. For 40-some years since the foundation of the project in 1976, Project Censored has been engaging students and college and university professors in an ongoing effort to identify news stories that are important but underreported. So there are important news stories that are reported in the independent press. They're high-quality news stories, but they're not getting the attention they deserve in the corporate media.
People don't trust corporate media, and I think that's good, but I think people are also wary of trusting any sort of media, and that's, of course, really dangerous. So I think that people need to not only look at the media as something that's over there, that, oh, those people don't know what they're talking about. Media always needs sources, and media always needs help.
So we need to really blow up what the news is about and start talking about what kinds of information and truth and knowledge do we need to survive going forward. And how can we not only learn about that and deconstruct it, take it apart, and figure out where we can get the best information, but how can we learn to make it ourselves?
Trying to get the students to be creative and talk about creating their own stories, their own images that are an alternative vision for the future. Right now, in terms of the environment, the vision of the future is pretty bleak. It doesn't have to play out that way. We've already laid the groundwork for understanding, for example, the ways in which global warming was denied through a concerted public relations effort. Once we know that, we have to move on to creating our own narratives.
So I'm really inspired by just like the tenacity and the willingness for change and the willingness to have these uncomfortable conversations with the younger generation. And so I'm inspired by that. It's up to us to create the media that we want to consume. You know, like be the change you want to see. Well, you know, like kind of create the media you want to see. Like, why not? We all have the tools. We all have the brains. You know, we all have the information.
They find youthful constituencies are not afraid to criticize capitalism. They are well aware that the American political system is broken, that the corporations, public relations, and all of the ways in which money determines and the wealth and powerful can basically call the shots in America. They understand that this needs to change.
Millennials in particular give me a lot of hope, the folks born between 1980 and 2000. They've grown up with these tools and they're already in the streets. We see them in all these different movements, from Occupy to Black Lives Matter and Democracy Spring and Me Too and Dreamers and DACA. They've seen the failures of neoliberalism. They've seen the failures of this technocratic belief that we must worship technology. And what's key is that not only they recognize those things, but they're going into direct confrontation. Nothing's done in the history of the United States without direct confrontation. Whites did not start coming around to granting civil rights until we had bus protests and violence in the streets. You didn't have women have the right to vote until there was conflicts during World War I in the street. I'm highly optimistic this generation is going to make the change that's going to be needed. Yeah, it's going to be painful, it's going to be difficult, but I'm optimistic. And I think if you're a true educator, you really are in the streets with your students, not just studying them on campus or talking about them in the classroom.
This is only really going to work and make a bigger splash when everybody is part of that solution, and even better, part of rethinking and recreating the kind of world that we really want to have, and what kind of information system will be necessary to do that in a world where we are ever tilting against fake news.
My name is Chase Palmieri. I'm the co-host of the Project Censored radio show and podcast with Mickey Huff, but I'm also the CEO and co-founder of a news review site called Credder.com. Now, Credder.com is just one of the many solutions being offered to solve kind of our fake news crises that we've talked about today. But what's interesting about Credder is that you can actually start to review the news that you're reading. So the way Credder works is it kind of takes a Rotten Tomatoes style approach to the news, where we have a critic category of verified journalists and a public category where you can actually review the articles that you're already reading. Now, these reviews will aggregate up into scores for the article's authors and outlets. And what this really is it's the first ever example of creating reputation that informs the readers, reputation scores for those authors and outlets. And again, this is how we can hold media accountable as news consumers. Many industries with consumers are going to have a way for the consumers to hold those producers accountable, and Credder is offering one of the many solutions in that space. If you really want to be active on the go as a news consumer, you can now use Credder.com, Credder.com, as one of the ways to review news content and hold media accountable and start to actually feel empowered as a news consumer in the digital age. Thank you.
talking to in the chat on YouTube are all joining us, and Dr. Nolan Higdon is going to join us in just a minute. But I want to welcome you, and okay, so I'm hearing there's no sound on the chat. Okay, but if you can hear, let us know. Okay, sound is working now, so thank you everyone for watching. I'm going to do that again. The United States of Distraction, Fighting the Fake News Invasion. We're joined by our panelists, Abby Martin, Eleanor Goldfield, and Mickey Huff, who are all involved in making this film. We want to, let's start with Abby. Thanks so much for being part of this discussion, Abby. So this film was just astounding to watch because so much of what was talked about and predicted really sort of exploded during this pandemic that we are all, living through and trying to survive. And obviously, a lot of the lessons were not learned or implemented as far as reforming the media. Just talk about how you've been dealing with this and just looking back at this film now, how you're processing.
I mean, look, the whole Trump era has kind of set us into a tailspin where we're fighting these mass hallucinations, right? It's either the fake news hysteria, where everything that doesn't worship our dear leader, Donald Trump, is deemed fake news, or criticizes the corporate media that tends to sensationalize a lot of the things that Trump's doing. That's fake news. But then everything that Trump does, or anything that's on alternative media, as the documentary explains, even my reporting on Breaking the Set under the banner of Russia Today is deemed Russian propaganda. And we see this narrative just peddled over and over and over again. And it just is astounding that we continue to see this charge at things that run contrary to the corporate media narrative or the mainstream narrative. And it's just absolutely insane that here we are 4 years into the Donald Trump presidency, and the Democratic establishment just still continues to deflect all of their inadequacies and all the things that really led us to the dystopian reality that we're living in today on Russia and on these foreign adversaries, instead of really taking stock on how they are complicit in getting us to this point. And one of the main things that they're complicit in is corporate media propaganda. I mean, so it was an honor to be a part of this film. I've been working with Project Censored for, Mickey, probably 15 years now. That's how I really got involved in media activism and media literacy. And it was just really, really fun to go through all of these interviews and put them together like a puzzle. And I just learned a lot making it, and I hope people enjoyed it. One other comment about, the pandemic era is, Trump's been able to kind of weaponize conspiracy theories, and people have just gone completely off the rails and detached from reality with this QAnon stuff. And it's just unbelievable. I feel like people's brains have really broken in the Trump era. So hopefully we can spread media literacy and get back to some sense of normalcy. It's going to be quite hard no matter what the outcome is in a couple weeks here.
And Mickey, I wanted to get your thoughts on that same question.
Well, thanks for having us here. It's been an honor to work with you all at Real News Network, and it was great to work with Nolan, a great long-time colleague of mine, and a lot of his students helped shoot this film. And Eleanor Goldfield has done great work for years. It was great to have her in the film when she was out at our conference. We do annual conferences here. And of course, Abby, I think it's back to maybe 06, 07. And back in the early Project Censored radio days, we had you hanging out with us, and then you went on to do amazing things. And so this film is about critical media literacy education. It's about education as the vehicle or antidote for change. We don't need censorship. We don't need algorithms. We don't need bots. We don't need, quote, fact checkers like Snopes or the Atlantic Council. We need real critical independent thinkers. And this film was shot in that sort of vein and with that in mind. And, Nolan and I and Andy Roth and many of the rest of us, we teach these things every semester in classes. And much like we do with our annual books at Project Censored, The United States of Distraction that Nolan and I did, his new book, The Anatomy of Fake News, with a fake news detection kit and a history of propaganda. We're dedicated to educating the public, not telling them what to think, but trying to help people learn how to think critically. And I think now that's probably more important than at any time in recent memory. We've got 6 corporations controlling 90% of the media in the United States. We have a relentless barrage of faux partisan propaganda funded by the same kind of corporate backers. As Jim Hightower once quipped, if the gods had wanted us to vote, they'd have given us candidates. And we're really in a situation right now that, as dire as it is, and as hard as it is to cut through the din, this is a golden opportunity not only for critical media education organizations, but also independent grassroots media, public sponsored media, not corporate, private, or commercial media, but public media in the public interest. And all the work we do with Project Censored and all the work that we put forward in this film really kind of goes toward that. And so we hope that we're able to continue to replicate it. We hope that it's shown in classrooms across the country. And we hope other people pick up cameras and pick up microphones and be the media. We're the solution that we're looking for. And so we really want to encourage people to, maybe see the film that we did and, go do your own work.
And I wanted to open it up to the other panelists as well.
I can pick up where Mickey left off, in particular about the grassroots aspect of it. There's a clear hunger for information. People want new perspectives. They want new media. For years, we heard that from news people that they could not have like longer segments or more in-depth reporting because the public wouldn't be interested. But I think like podcasting spaces and online like video services demonstrate that people are hungry and interested for something more in-depth than like this trivial hyper-partisan BS that the corporate press peddles. So as much as there's reason to be pessimistic about the media and political system, I think there's also a lot of reason to be optimistic when you look at this new media landscape.
And we wanted to get you in too.
I'm assuming you mean me.
Sorry,
Eleanor.
Eleanor.
I think as I said before, media literacy is really possibly the most important issue because it is the window through which we view all other issues, and so how we understand media literacy is vital. And I think that right now, particularly when you have a country that is so divided and divisive, it's vital that people engage in media literacy, and it's vital that journalists, like the ones that we have in this film and like the ones that are on this panel, are really highlighting the importance of telling the story and telling the manifold stories as well. Because I think it's also important to highlight that there's not one story. Which is, of course, the purview that you have when you watch corporate media. Oh, this is the story, which is, of course, just the state's story. But the stories on the ground, the stories from the people that are actually affected by the policies, by the dirty energy projects, by empire here at home, and, of course, elsewhere. So I think it's really important that we have this understanding of the wide breadth of stories that are available to people, and that this information is amplified and protected by projects like Project Censored.
Yeah, and I guess it's kind of wild to me to think about how we have a president who can be just bragging about being cured from coronavirus while he's actively spreading it, yet 43% of the population will just believe it no matter what he says. It's just really hard to wrap your mind around it when there's 200,000 people dead and hundreds of thousands or more might be dead in the next few months.
Well, and here's a fun fact, because I'm in Washington, D.C., and I've been doing a lot of work with Washington, D.C. Mutual Aid. A couple of weeks ago, on Monday, we had 14 new cases of coronavirus. And a few days later, in the White House alone, so in one building, there were 34 new cases. And DC is not known for its exemplary healthcare. It actually leads the country in issues like maternal mortality. So somehow the community got together and was able to move the needle down to 14 new cases of coronavirus. But then in one building, you had 34 new cases. And that really speaks to the paradigm of that administration, the paradigm of this sort of anti-science perspective that is not just shared, of course, by Trump, but by many people around the country.
And I know we're talking about things that are obviously very heavy and sad and depressing and stuff we're all, dealing with in our personal lives. But what gives you all hope right now, despite these enormous challenges we face?
I mean, if I can speak first to that. I mean, being an educator and working with young people is a great source of hope. Young people have every reason in the world to complain and be pretty upset with the world that the baby boomers have bestowed upon them and the senior citizen candidates they're offering them to run the free world, free in quotes. But young people don't really avoid that kind of pessimism that I come in contact with. They're really fixated on solutions and taking action. And I think that's why it's fun to teach critical media literacy in an era like this, because students are hungry not only to learn more, but they want to take action. And I get the feeling they want to sort of transform our society to the place they want to live rather than the one that's been handed to them. So I find them a great source of positivity.
I think another source of positivity. Oh, sorry, Mickey, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead, Abby, go ahead.
I think I find optimism in the fact that there are so many young people who have kind of taken the mantle of the Bernie movement and also rejecting the status quo of capitalism. Because I think that when you're looking at corporate media propaganda, capitalism is essentially just provides that vehicle for advertising. And that's really what media has become in this late stage capitalism that we're living in. So the fact that, tens of millions of people who are young and who really are the future of this country are completely rejecting all of these narratives. They're looking at the world in a wide view. They're understanding our role in the world. They understand what empire is. And so you have, there's this kind of multi-generational struggle, I think, where a lot of people are devolving into fantastical thinking, these crisis cults, as things get more dire, especially facing these kind of cataclysmic, the climate emergency and all of these other things. But certainly the fact that there is this wide protest movement that has just been going on for months and months, really just, again, like challenging all of these things that have been so fundamental to the ruling class is something that's really positive to me. And I feel like we can just continue to build on it because these people aren't going away. Bernie may have gotten shut down by the DNC and the Democratic establishment, but all of these people are still there and they're still fighting. And it's time to start building upon this movement that's really energized and amazing.
So I know Eleanor has definitely things to add into this in terms of grassroots activism and a lot of the positive things that we see. There are so many people across generations. I'm obviously going to agree with Nolan and emphasize the youth. And as an educator and a professor, one of the most privileged things I can do is get to spend time with so many people, that have these different perspectives. And it's really important. In fact, I would like to point out, if I may, that all of the folks here are millennials, not me. I'm Gen X. I get the variable. I'm approaching the half-century mark here this year. But I have the privilege of working with not just students, but all of the people on this panel. That's what gives me hope, is that there are people that are grabbing the baton, they're lighting the torch, they're taking off, they're making their own media, they're making their own shows, they're teaching. Nolan's teaching at several places with us out here in California. We're not just writing books, we're writing textbooks. We're doing podcasts, we're doing multimedia, we're doing film. I mean, we're doing so many things. And the more we do these things, the more we find out that there are so many other people doing them with us. And, there's several hundred people on
the YouTube channel here for an event like this on a random Tuesday, that's pretty hopeful. If you think about how we used to do events before the COVID, having several hundred people in a theater is a big deal. Well, we are in a theater and we are all talking with each other. And this is something that we can share beyond this evening, and we can share these kind of resources. I have to say that it's the younger people and the students that I work with on the one end, and then on the other end, it's people like Ralph Nader, or Daniel Ellsberg, or these other people that I know that are, octogenarians, that they're very willing to cross all barriers to try to, again, pass off that baton. While we're sitting here doing this, Julian Assange is rotting in prison, right? One of the most cherished and important whistleblowers of our time, right? And yet the corporate media in the United States stands by and does nothing but castigate him or benefit from his leaks while basically shooting the messenger. I think that there's a tide that's long turned, and I think people are really tired of corporate media. I think people want to really know what's going on around them. And I think people really support real news, not just the Real News Network, which is, we're very honored to partner with, but real news in any capacity, like the stuff that we do on the Project Censored show, the Along the Lines podcast, Act Out, Common Censored, the Empire Files, Manar Mahawesh, Mint Press News, Alan McLeod. There's so many people doing so much good work that it's hard for me not to be hopeful, actually. You've got to turn off corporate media and the negative noise machine in order to really see the things that are happening right in front of you.
Yeah, and to sort of piggyback off of that, I think turning off the corporate media and engaging with the stories that exist in our communities. I mean, one of the primary things that gives me hope is the building of alternatives, because there's a lot of fighting the status quo, which I obviously think is important. We have to be anti-capitalist and anti-fascist and anti-racist, but what are we for? What is the alternative that we're building in the midst of this failing and flailing empire? And I think that what really gives me hope is seeing people build that in the here and now and share their stories, and sort of take over the narrative and say, that history. We just came off of Indigenous Peoples Day. That history that you're taught in school, that's not history. That's a singular white supremacist perspective. Here's actually our stories, which makes up the history that we're all a part of. And in order to understand where we are and where we're going, we have to understand these stories of the past. And these people telling those stories are vital for our future. And the building of those alternatives in the here and now is not only a way to combat capitalism in a very real way, but also to go beyond the lines that are drawn for us. When we go, give people medical care and mutual aid, we don't ask them, who did you vote for? We just say hey, this is a really cool mutual aid endeavor. This is about solidarity, not charity. This is about the community caring for itself. And here's why we're doing it. And building those relationships in a very real way creates the sort of alternative that people can call, anarchism, or people can call democratic confederalism, or what have you. Whatever name you want to put on it, the actual action of creating it is what gives me hope. And it's happening all over the place. And perhaps the pandemic, more so than anything in the past, has really engaged people across the globe to create these networks, because we're all dealing with the same disaster at the same time for the first time, at least in my lifetime, as opposed to, there's this one hurricane here, or there's this one coup here. We're all experiencing this global pandemic and the need to fill in the gaping chasms left by capitalism. And so these alternatives that are being built across the globe right now, that really gives me hope, because that's not only the way to deal with the here and now, but that's the way to deal with the continuation of the devolving capitalism and devolving empire, and to build the alternative moving forward.
And we had a question from the chat, and this is for Abby, but all the panelists can weigh in. So the question is: apart from sharing content and supporting financially independent news media sources, how else can we keep these sources afloat during these perilous times?
I mean, I think that's
that's the primary objective right there, right? Is supporting the journalists that you want to see flourish and grow. And that's unfortunately it's a sign of the times that we have to even, have Patreons and ask for help. But really there is such limited opportunities for growth and for jobs if you're really challenging the narratives like Eleanor just talked about. I mean, capitalism, US empire, these are things that simply are not discussed on the corporate media circuit, right? Or media that's funded by these right-wing billionaires or oil companies or banks or defense contractors. And so that's why entities like Real News Network, entities like Project Censored, things that Eleanor is doing, the Empire Files, all of these things are essentially grassroots, people's funded, that tell the stories of the commons. And that's why it's so important to keep these entities afloat. And it's a dire situation. It really is, frankly. And it's really sad to see so many media outlets fold, right, in recent months and years. And it's up to us. It's really up to us and the people who want to support these perspectives to keep putting the support into these networks. And that's also sharing the content and challenging your friends, families, and coworkers, right? Challenging those narratives that they pick up. And talking about alternative media, talking about media literacy, and talking about these issues that are so obvious to people who are in this movement already. But we need to share these and we need to open people's eyes because, again, I mean, we are in a truth emergency, right? And according to our dear leader and all of the corporate media punditry, this is kind of a post-truth world. And so it's up to us, the people who have been fighting this whole time in the trenches to spread this information and to really create that understanding of media literacy, that foundation that we all need to build upon. Because like Eleanor said, and like Nolan said in the documentary, media literacy has to be your first issue before you can even care about anything else, before you can even speak about anything else, because you can't get the information out there unless you have a free and open press to do so.
Yeah, I think going off that, I agree with Abby completely. In addition to supporting in those ways, I think you also need to create a context in which these alternative outlets can thrive. And one thing that I have a lot of concern about is the lack of principles, that people stand up for free speech when it's someone on quote unquote their side, or a press outlet when it's on their side. I think we'd be a lot better served if we stood up for freedom of speech. If Abby wanted to if Abby was invited to give a speech at a university and it was canceled, I would stand up for her right to give that speech. Or if a professor was investigating something that people found unpopular on campus, I would defend their right. And same thing with the freedom of the press. I think standing up for Assange, regardless of how you feel about him or WikiLeaks, is irrelevant. We should agree that we support freedom of the press. And also, like the suppression of journalists online. I know we've abdicated our democratic responsibility by putting social media billionaires in charge of what constitutes freedom of speech in our social platform. But we shouldn't let these folks censor these independent voices because they're not going after pernicious actors. Solely pernicious actors. They're also going after a lot of the very press outlets we depend on to give us the information we need. So I think creating that context for where the work that folks like Abby and others are doing is crucial.
I want to double down on what Nolan said. We have to support academic freedom. We have to support a truly independent, vibrant, free press. We have to know censors, KNOW. And we have to say no, NO, to censorship, period. Mm-hmm. We have to get over the fact that we get offended by different ideas, and we have to start arguing factually and transparently, not just about the key issues of our day, but that we want open platforms. Nolan and I began the United States of Distraction book with a Lao Tzu quote that says, if you do not change direction, you may end up where you're heading. Are we there yet? We've been heading here for well over half a century. You saw in the movie with T.M. Scruggs. Nolan and I are historians by day, one of the hats we wear. Propaganda and fake news is nothing new, but it's really gone off leash and it's really blown up in our technocratic culture in the 21st century. And we really need education and media platforms, not only to tell people what's actually going on, as a 20th century journalist George Seldes once said, but we actually need to learn about the systems and platforms themselves and who controls them. And so that we can also not only just navigate them, but also learn how to create better systems of information dissemination ourselves. And I think that the way that we do that moving forward is by, again, basing it on these core principles of academic freedom, of a truly free press, opposing censorship, and that we also begin demanding that I'm going to repeat this, that we have a truly public-based media and educational system. In our books, we argue that there are various things we can do to correct these problems. The last chapter of United States of Distraction, our City Lights book, is called Make America Think Again. And we go through a whole list of things that anybody can do to become more informed in terms of how they digest news and even maybe become part of news production themselves. In Nolan's book on the anatomy of fake news that has just come out this summer, he has a whole list of 10 things to do to try to check information veracity. So it's about broadening your news frame, diversifying the news that you hear, but it's also getting back to the basics. And we're writing a book now on critical thinking for Routledge called Let's Agree to Disagree. We've forgotten how to talk to each other. Maybe we never knew how. But we end up in these extraordinarily divisive climates where people aren't even speaking the same languages. And there's no way forward from that kind of Tower of Babel nonsense. We really need to rely on, we're not in a post-truth world, right? First of all, we need to remember that we live in an empirical universe. There are such things as facts. There are such things as transparently sourced information, and we need to demand them. And if corporate media isn't providing those, we need to turn off the corporate media, and we need to turn on to these other alternatives while, I would argue, simultaneously supporting critical media literacy educational efforts. On YouTube, I posted numerous comments about places to go, whether it's gcml.org, the Global Critical Media Literacy Project, projectcensored.org. We give away our curriculum for free, and we've been working with colleges and universities across the United States since 1976. If you're out there and you're interested in how to bring this work to the classroom or bring it to whatever other platform you're working on, please be in touch with us. We're very interested in working together and building the networks we have based on critical media literacy and a truly free press.
So there's been a bunch of questions about the election, which is a topic we haven't, directly talked about yet. But obviously, we're facing, there's two major parties at the ballot box across the country. One party knows that it's running out of time to seize and accumulate as much power as possible before the demographics of this country change forever, and they'll have to evolve as a party, or they'll be, totally irrelevant. Which is part of the reason why they're trying to get the Supreme Court seat locked in before the election, even if it means spreading coronavirus all over DC. And then we have another party that has shown its extreme hostility to progressive ideas and progressive values, throughout the campaign. So again, I wanted to open it up, and how do we navigate this? On one side we're facing Donald Trump, on the other side we're facing the Democratic Party, and how do we navigate it? How do we navigate what also things we just saw the vice presidential debate where a candidate said they believe in science, but also let's go fracking was like the other sentence out of their mouth. So I just wanted to go around again and get your thoughts. And we can start with Abby, it's your first step.
I think the first thing is not vote shaming anyone, and that's if you want to, vote for what you want, which is, the Eugene Debs quote, like, I'd rather vote for what I want and not get it than vote for what I don't want and get it. But I also think that people shouldn't shame people in swing states who want to vote for Biden, because I do agree that, Trump is a pretty big nightmare, and, like you said, they are trying to hold on to power, and it worries me, this kind of galvanization of these right-wing militias and all the things that Trump is doing in the streets to foment and sow
distrust in the system to the point where people are going to go out and possibly fight and die on his behalf. So that is also very scary. But yeah, I mean, the Democratic establishment is a complete nightmare, and all they've done this entire time is reject progressivism, throw Bernie's base under the bus, and cater to moderates and Republicans. It's an absolute, it's a very, very disgusting two-party dictatorship that we're living under. But we can't try to reform the Democratic Party. I mean, this is a dangerous concept. I think the fact that there's this squad, right, of progressives that are sitting congresspeople out of 240 members, that kind of gives people the notion that we can reform the system, right, and that electoralism is where we need to put all of our energy into, and somehow we can have these insurgent candidates take and usurp the Democratic Party from below. And I just think that that's not true. And it kind of lends legitimacy to the system where in reality we need to be fighting on the turf of the people, fighting grassroots, really building alternatives, as Eleanor talked about, because we can't keep putting our faith into the electoral system over and over again. Voting should just be an action that takes you 5 minutes, and then you should just go right back to building these networks and structures and building with people, right? And building coalitions of alternatives, because that's really where the future needs to be and how we can get out of this mess. And we can't ever push the system to change unless there's essentially tens of millions of us in the streets, right? Forcing their hand. And so, yeah, I mean, the election is horrible, but really, would we expect anything else from where we've been headed for the past couple of decades? I mean, for the past 20 years, there's been a gun to progressives' heads saying, you need to vote for Democrats, otherwise the Supreme Court's going to overturn Roe v. Wade. And here's the situation unfolding right before our eyes, and look at the Democrats. They're laying down and dying. They're not doing a goddamn thing to stop this nomination. And I think that really shows you who they are.
It's Lucy with the football and Charlie Brown, man. 'Tis the season for the great pumpkin. So here we go. And to say so, I just have to reiterate that fantastic line, Abby. The idea of vote shaming in general it's just got no place in discourse. In fact, we lack critical discourse, and the great critical pedagogy scholar, Henry Giroux, said, in the end, there is no democracy without informed citizens. Well, how informed are our citizens if they're reading, the Russiagate nonsense at Washington Post or the New York Times or Rachel Maddow or CNN? How informed are our citizens if they're glued to Breitbart, QAnon, or Fox News? This, again, we dissect this in our books. These kind of major platforms, they're propaganda organs. Do they report accurately on some things? Yes. But do they also try to divide and distract us any chance they get? That's their modus operandi. And we can see, right, in the last presidential election, there were more people that were registered to vote that didn't vote than voted for either of the two major corporate party candidates. And we're always told about the spoiler. Much like in the same vein as vote shaming, we have the spoiler politic game where it's Ralph Nader or Jill Stein or somebody else that caused the problem. No, the problem is our election system has been a sham from the beginning when almost nobody could vote, right? Almost nobody could vote. And it's only been since the early 20th century that you could vote for senators. We still don't vote for the president in the United States. Right. And as we said, we're down to about 6 corporations controlling most of the news that people get, even though record numbers of people are tired of the rhetoric of both corporate parties and are tired of corporate media. So you don't get to quote or paraphrase Rahm Emanuel's neoliberal nonsense every day. But, let's not let a good crisis go to waste. There is now an opportunity to get ranked choice voting. There's an opportunity to change electoral systems. There's a chance to broaden our news frames and news horizons and platforms. There's opportunities to stand up against censorship, to stand up against cancel culture of any kind, and really build the kind of society we want. We're already in 2020. The 21st century is a fifth over. If you look at the actual scientists on climate change, we might not make it to the end at this point as a species. So I think it's really imperative that we take we started earlier on a question about hope and what are you hopeful for? I'm hopeful that not just the people watching, but the people we interact with, I think they intuitively know some of this stuff. And I think that if we model more of the behavior that brings it forward, other people might feel comfortable sharing it, and we'll have the opportunity to build bigger, broader, more diverse coalitions that are based on public interests and a true small d democratic culture.
I'll jump in and echo. I'm going to also just say this, that do not vote shame. I know 2 people have said it, but I'm going to repeat it again. It's a horrible strategy. But in addition, I'll also say that one of the I think problems progressives have that they need to face in this election, or the case they need to make, is that Trump is not an aberration. He is the logical end of where we've been going. And so this idea that we remove him from office and then we all celebrate is just completely unfounded. There's a lot of problems with our press, our politics, our education system that still remain. They're the ones that cultivated the environment that created Trump's presidency. I mean, the DNC, its funding base exists to make sure that the DNC politicians keep progressives and progressive legislation off the floor. That's why Joe Biden told funders a couple weeks ago that nothing will fundamentally change if he's elected president. Or electorate, I should say. So yeah, change happens in this country, and this gets to Abby's point. When you scare the people in power, so you need people in the streets, and you need to frighten them, and they're clearly not frightened. I mean, in this COVID crisis, both parties worked to bail out the super wealthy, and they basically gave the working class a runner-up prize that gave them an extra month or 2 before the suffering kicked in further. So they're clearly not scared. I mean, you'd think that. COVID is such a prime example of all the people that the corporate media laughed at during the primary. Their policies were desperately needed. Like, people right now desperately would, wish that our trade agreements were different so we could manufacture our own PPE and get it out to people. They wish they had universal health care. UBI seems like it makes a lot of sense with the poverty and suffering we have. And not to mention reparations. Marianne Williamson was like the solo appeal for that on the stage. It was kind of laughed at. But all of a sudden, these ideas that were laughed at in the corporate press during the primary, there's really a clear case to be made in COVID. So I think, echoing Mickey's point, don't let a good crisis go to waste. I think we need to really seriously examine these policies and make the case and scare the people in power until we get it.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just say with regards to electoral politics, I mean, I'll go ahead and say that's not my thing. But I think that it's important when we talk about elections that we understand that we don't actually have elections in this country. It's a farcical point, because elections suggest that you actually have a choice, not just between, the blue MAGA hat and the red MAGA hat, or the blue dumpster fire and the red dumpster fire, but you actually have a choice between multiple parties. Even if there was a difference between the 2 parties, that you had a choice between different parties that had significantly different platforms that spoke to a different future entirely. And I think that even if, that aside, our election system is entirely undemocratic. I mean, you just look at the, you look at the way that our system is set up. You have the Electoral College, but that's just the tip of the iceberg. You have things like interstate cross-check that just knocks people off the voter rolls if they sound or look like they're Latinx or Black or brown. You have Jim Crow-style voting regulations that are in place. You have polling places closing willy-nilly. You have ballots that don't get counted. You have mail-in ballots that get thrown away if there's just one little thing wrong with them, and yet the instructions to use them are very confusing and arbitrary. So to talk about elections as if we actually had a democratic electoral system at its core is a farce. So that's the first thing. And then, to Mickey's point, talking about the idea of, everybody having an equal voice. Yeah, I mean, at the beginning of this country, only 6% of the people could vote, and that was white land-owning men and property-owning men, which also meant slaves. And the founding fathers actually spoke to this point. They didn't want a complete democracy because that would mean that they would actually lose power. And the trajectory of that dream, that American dream, is very clear today. And I think, to Abby's point about getting people out in the streets, that is where I feel not only my hope lies, but where the power lies. And so in terms of electoral politics, I won't vote shame, but I also won't say that my hope or any sort of hope for the future lies in electoral politics, because I just don't think it does. I think locally, perhaps you can have some progress built. For instance, in Washington, D.C., there's something on the bill this November talking about legalizing psilocybin mushrooms. Great. Those sort of local progressive ideas can definitely make a difference in your backyard. But ultimately, when we're talking about like U.S. empire and the larger issue of the United States as an entity, I don't think it lies in electoral politics. And another percentage to just throw at folks is that there have been studies that have shown that no government has withstood more than 3.5% of the population rising up against it. And this is not just in terms of like a violent, revolutionary type rising up. This just means like what Abby was talking about, like getting out in the streets. And 3.5% of the population is not that much when you're looking at 300 million or more people that live in the United States. So I think that is where we build our power, not in the ballot box. And again, to Abby's point, like if you're going to vote, please do. But look at it, the way I talk about it is like, it's like using your turn signal when you're driving. Like, yes, you should do that, but I'm not going to stop what I'm doing to applaud you for doing that. It's just something that you should do. And then outside of that, you should also be like, watching the road and making sure that you don't hit a pedestrian and all these other things that make you like a responsible and good driver. So I think that, these other issues outside of the electoral politics system are things that we really need to focus on.
And I think we have time for one or two more questions, but we had a question from the audience about in the case that, as a lot of people, or as Trump has said himself, that he will not accept the results of the election on election day, when the day is over, when he may be ahead in votes, but he's still going to lose, if that's the case, which I think is an important call to action for everyone in this country, regardless of your political beliefs. What steps are you taking? What steps can people take to prepare for what seems like an almost inevitable situation?
I'll just say I question the inevitability of this. I wonder if the Democratic Party has been just playing up this end of democracy Trump storyline. Trump, like he always does, takes their political misstep and he uses it to his advantage. I mean, I have a close relation to this with fake news. And I studied it. It was really Hillary Clinton who started using it against Trump supporters, and then he used it and capitalized upon it. And I think this fear of democracy is closely related. I keep hearing this like democracy is on the ballot. If one person is the end of democracy and they're already president, then there's no democracy on the ballot. Your game is already over. So I think this is kind of a canard. And if he does challenge the results, and to the opposite of what Eleanor was saying earlier, but if 3.5% of the population or more decide to agree with him and go against any ruling, we don't have a democracy anyways, and it's not really Trump's fault. Again, I think it speaks to, like, he definitely exacerbates it, but I think it speaks to a deeper problem with the society. So I don't think it's sort of clear cut as the Democrats are making it. And furthermore, they're also the party that have been throwing the Green Party off of various states' ballots this electoral season. So them caring about democracy seems pretty empty in my mind.
I can jump in. So
go for it.
Brevity's not a strong point of mine, so I'll jump in there. I can't really see the Democrats as being like some strong, stewards of a democratic republic that we don't have. I mean, even the elitists at Princeton and Northwestern called us a plutocracy and an oligarchy 6 years ago. They finally figured it out over there. But you go back to 1787, the Constitutional Convention. The fabled story of Ben Franklin coming out and a woman asking him, "What's up?" And he says, "Oh, we have a republic if you can keep it." Well, we never had one, and we certainly don't seem to be able to keep it very well. I mean, take a look at like completely undemocratic parts of our government, like the Supreme Court. That's going on right now. A vast majority of people in this country do not support the positions that the person that is now up for the seat held by Ruth Bader Ginsburg. None of that matters. A majority of Americans want Medicare for all. A majority of Americans think the Green New Deal is a good idea. A majority of Americans fill in the blank. As Sheldon Wallen said, and Chris Hedges helped popularize some of this, we live in an inverted totalitarian state, sort of a corporate society governed with illusions of a government facade that responds to the people every 2 or 4 years. I don't mean to say that in a negative or cynical way. I mean to suggest that we need to understand it in a very realistic way so that we know the kind of things that we can change and that we can do at the ballot box, which is, by the way, riddled with election fraud, cyberspace, voter suppression, Jim Crow in cyberspace, cross-check. We could have a whole show on this, between Greg Palast, Joel Simon, Mark Miller, and others. But to not just keep to be terribly negative about it, anything Trump tweets or says is fodder for a 24/7 corporate news cycle that has an even smaller attention span. That's why these people do not represent what's actually going on in our society, and it's really time we turn them off. And I don't mean to stop taking them seriously. I just mean that we need to start taking ourselves more seriously. And we need to be platforming each other. We need to be supporting our own independent networks and the people that are here on this panel. We need to support educators that are really down for this. Nolan talked about in the movie that educators, the one to help support their students, aren't just talking at them in the classroom. They're actually with them in the streets. Well, the streets just means the public sphere. It means anything outside that we need to be doing. And I think that there's a lot of hope and there's a lot of possibility yet left. But we can't just cede it to the two major parties, and we can't cede it, to whatever the myopic frame that we're given is the only area within which we can contest this stuff. So as Eleanor said, if we only need 3%, that's several million people, that's 9-odd million people. We've had at least half of that, going on between Black Lives Matter, Occupy, Dreamers. If you look at those numbers globally, we're way over that. So, I think, again, we need to remember those things and, again, not be distracted by sort of the political theater and pseudo event that is the American electoral system.
All right. Well, I want to thank our panelists, Abby Martin, Eleanor Goldfield, Nolan Higdon, and Mickey Huff for joining us on The Real News and for helping us discuss this new film, United States of Distraction. Thank you all for joining us.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks for having us. It was an honor to be here.
Yeah, and this link will be live on our YouTube page, and we'll include information about how to find more information about the film and all the work that the panelists are doing. So thank you all for watching.